Laura Harrington sat in the stuffy conference room, the air heavy with the scent of old leather and polished wood. The attorney, a gray-haired man in a dark blue suit named Richard Calloway, shuffled through a stack of papers with a meticulous calm that grated on her nerves. Sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting thin stripes of light across the walnut table where Laura and her younger sister, Emily, sat on opposite sides, as if they were already adversaries. Laura's hands clenched in her lap, her nails digging into her palms as she watched Emily flip through her phone with a bored expression, perfectly manicured nails tapping rhythmically against the glass screen. Emily had always been the golden child, the one who stayed behind, the one who got married to a wealthy investment banker, the one who gave their parents a grandchild. Meanwhile, Laura had left home at 20 to start a business that never quite took off, drifting from job to job, each failure more pronounced than the last. "Thank you for your patience," Richard said, his voice cutting through the tense silence. He adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat, looking at them both with the practiced neutrality of someone who had seen families torn apart by inheritance disputes before. "I'm here to read the last will and testament of Samuel and Irene Harrington, dated June 15th, 2024. Laura swallowed, a tight knot forming in her throat. She had expected this day to come. Their parents had both passed within a month of each other. First their father from a heart attack, and then their mother, unable to bear the loneliness, following him soon after. But nothing could have prepared her for the flood of emotions that surged through her now. Richard began reading, his voice a flat, monotonous drone as he listed off minor bequests, sentimental items like their mother's jewelry, their father's collection of vintage records, a few small investments. Emily yawned, clearly uninterested until Richard reached the section about the family home. "And to our beloved daughter, Emily Grace Harrington, we bequeath our primary residence located at 1425 Meadow Lane in its entirety, along with all contents and belongings therein. It is our express wish that Emily retain the property as a family home for as long as she desires, and to use it in accordance with her needs and wishes." Laura's mouth went dry. She sat rigidly, her eyes fixed on a small crack in the table's varnish. Emily's lips curved into a self-satisfied smirk as she shot a glance at Laura. "Well," Emily said, leaning back in her chair with a theatrical sigh, "I guess that settles it." Laura felt a sharp sting behind her eyes, but she refused to cry. The house where she had grown up, where her father had taught her how to ride a bike on the driveway, where her mother had baked banana bread every Sunday. The house she had thought, perhaps naively, that they would both share, or at least have some say over. Instead, it was now Emily's, entirely Emily's. "There must be some mistake," Laura said, her voice coming out more tremulous than she intended. "I mean, I live there too. Doesn't it say anything about me?" Richard adjusted his glasses again, his expression placid and unaffected. "There is a provision for you, Laura," he said, turning a page. "To our dear daughter, Laura Marie Harrington, we bequeath the sum of $5,000 to be distributed to her upon the settlement of our estate." Laura felt the words like a slap across the face. $5,000. That was it. Emily got the house, the family heirlooms, the contents of the property, everything. And Laura got a meager sum that wouldn't even cover 2 months of rent in her dingy apartment. "That's it," Laura said, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. $5,000? I'm their daughter too." Emily let out a derisive snort, crossing her arms over her chest. "Well, maybe if you hadn't run off to play entrepreneur for 20 years, they might have remembered you in the will. But you know what they say, out of sight, out of mind." Laura's jaw clenched, her fists tightening until her knuckles went white. She opened her mouth to respond, but Richard raised a hand, cutting her off. "I understand this is difficult," he said in that calm, practiced tone of someone who had delivered bad news to far too many families. "But your parents were of sound mind and body when they executed this will. There is no indication that they were coerced or otherwise influenced in their decision-making. This is their final, binding wish." Laura's eyes burned as she struggled to hold back the tears threatening to spill over. She glanced at Emily, who was now scrolling through her phone again as if the entire ordeal had been nothing more than a formality, a minor inconvenience before she took possession of the house that had been Laura's childhood home too. "I don't understand," Laura said, her voice small and choked. "I was their daughter too. I was always there for them before I left. How could they do this to me?" Richard cleared his throat and closed the folder, folding his hands over it. "If you feel there has been some oversight, or if you wish to contest the will, I would advise you to seek independent legal counsel. But as it stands, this is the final word on the matter." Emily stood up, sliding her designer handbag over her shoulder with a theatrical flair. "Well, that was fun," she said with a bright, insincere smile. "Good luck with your $5,000, Laura. I'll be over at the house, packing up Mom and Dad's things. If there's anything you want, you better come get it before it all goes to Goodwill." Laura sat there, frozen, her heart pounding in her chest as Emily sauntered out of the room, her heels clicking against the polished hardwood floors. The silence that followed was deafening, and for a long moment, Laura couldn't move. Then, slowly, she stood up, her knees shaky and her mind a whirlwind of confusion and anger. That was it, $5,000. A pittance compared to the lifetime of memories she had shared in that house. Memories that Emily had no right to claim as her own. But as Laura reached the door, something flickered in her mind, a memory from 20 years ago. Her father's voice, low and serious, saying, "Keep this somewhere safe, Laura. One day it might mean everything." Laura stopped, her hand hovering over the doorknob. Could it be possible? Could that old document still hold any power after all these years? And in that moment, as the weight of the betrayal settled deep in her chest, a slow, determined resolve began to harden inside her. Maybe she had been forgotten, cast aside as the black sheep, the one who never quite measured up. But she still had that document, and if her father's words had meant anything at all, it was time to find it. Laura Harrington sat on the edge of her bed in the cramped one-bedroom apartment she had called home for the past 5 years. The walls were a faded beige, the carpet worn thin from years of neglect, and the air was thick with the scent of stale coffee and lingering disappointment. Outside, rain pattered against the window pane, each drop a rhythmic reminder of everything she had lost and everything she was about to lose. The scene at the lawyer's office replayed in her mind like a broken record. Emily's smug smirk, the self-satisfied gleam in her sister's eyes as she absorbed the news that she now owned the house. Their parents' house. The house where Laura had grown up, where she had spent countless evenings curled up in the living room with her father, listening to old jazz records, or baking cookies with her mother in the cozy, cramped kitchen. Now it was all Emily's. $5,000. A laughable sum, barely enough to cover a few months' rent, let alone secure her future. Emily had made it clear that Laura was no longer welcome at the house. If she wanted to keep any of their parents' belongings, she would have to act fast before Emily shipped everything off to Goodwill. Laura's jaw tightened, and she clenched her fists in her lap. It was as if Emily had been waiting for this moment her entire life. The moment when she could finally assert her dominance and rub Laura's failures in her face. Emily, the successful one, the one who stayed close to home, the one who gave their parents a grandchild. Laura, the black sheep, the screw-up, the one who had chased dreams that never materialized, always coming up just short of success. But there was something Emily didn't know, something that Laura herself had almost forgotten. The document. Laura's heart thudded against her ribcage as she stood abruptly, her mind racing. 20 years ago, when she was 18 and just about to leave for college, her father had approached her with a serious, almost desperate look in his eyes. Samuel Harrington had always been a proud, stubborn man, the kind who would rather bleed to death than ask for help. But that day, he had swallowed his pride and come to her, asking for a loan. Laura could still picture the scene vividly. Her father pacing the small, cluttered den, his hands wringing together, his brow furrowed in deep lines of worry. The family business, a small hardware store that had been the family for 3 generations, was on the verge of collapse. A competitor had opened a massive home improvement warehouse down the street, and customers were flocking there in droves. leaving Samuel's store empty and struggling. "I need your help, Laura," her father had said, his voice tight with strain. "If I don't get this loan, the bank's going to foreclose on the store. Everything I've worked for, everything my father built, it'll all be gone." Laura had been stunned. She had saved up nearly $150,000 over the years through a combination of odd jobs, part-time work, and a small inheritance from her maternal grandmother. It was supposed to be her college fund, the money that would allow her to escape the small town and make something of herself. But in that moment, seeing the desperation in her father's eyes, the anguish in his voice, she couldn't say no. "Dad," she had said, swallowing the lump in her throat, "I'll give you the money, but I need something in writing." Samuel had agreed immediately, almost too eagerly. He had drawn up a promissory note, promising to repay the loan in full within 5 years, with the family home listed as collateral. If the loan wasn't repaid, the house would revert to Laura, a safeguard, he had said, to make sure she wasn't left with nothing. And then the years had passed. The hardware store never recovered. The debt had been quietly swept under the rug, never mentioned again. The promissory note had been locked away in a safety deposit box, gathering dust along with old birth certificates, expired passports, and other forgotten documents. Until now, Laura snapped back to the present, her breathing quick and shallow. She grabbed her coat, her purse, and her car keys, her hands shaking as she moved through the small apartment. There was no time to waste. She had to get to the bank and retrieve the document before Emily realized what she was up to. The drive to the bank was a blur, rain splattering against the windshield, headlights slicing through the gray haze of the late afternoon. Laura's mind raced as she navigated the slick roads, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. Would the document still be there? Would it still be valid after all these years? When she finally pulled into the parking lot of the downtown bank, she was drenched in sweat despite the chill in the air. She sprinted through the rain, her shoes slipping against the wet pavement, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Inside, the bank was nearly empty. A security guard gave her a wary glance as she approached the front desk, her hair plastered to her forehead, her clothes soaked through. "I need access to my safety deposit box," she said, her voice shaking. "Now." The teller, a young man with kind eyes, nodded and asked for her ID. Laura fumbled through her purse, her fingers trembling as she handed over her driver's license. Moments later, she was escorted to a small, windowless room in the back of the bank. The walls were lined with rows of metal boxes, each one secured with a heavy lock. Laura's hands shook as she slid the key into the lock, turning it with a sharp click. Inside, the box was a jumble of old papers, faded photographs, and a tarnished silver locket her mother had given her when she was a child. But there, at the bottom of the pile, was the document, the promissory note. Laura's breath caught in her throat as she pulled it out, her eyes scanning the familiar handwriting. It was dated, notarized, and signed in her father's bold, looping scrawl. The terms were clear and explicit: $150,000 to be repaid within 5 years, or the house would revert to Laura as collateral. The debt had never been repaid. The house should be hers. Laura's hands trembled as she held the document close to her chest, a surge of hope coursing through her veins. For the first time since the will reading, she felt as though she had a chance to reclaim what was rightfully hers, a chance to stand up to Emily and finally make her see that Laura was not the failure she had always been made to feel. But as she returned to her car, the document safely tucked into her purse, another thought crept into her mind, chilling her to the bone. Emily wasn't going to give up the house without a fight, and knowing her sister's ruthless, conniving nature, Laura had to be prepared for anything. As she started the car and pulled out of the parking lot, her jaw set with grim determination. This wasn't just about the house. This was about everything. Every slight, every insult, every dismissal, every time Emily had made her feel small and insignificant. And now, with the document in her possession, Laura finally had the power to fight back. But how far was she willing to go to win? And how much was she willing to lose in the process? Laura Harrington sat at the kitchen table in her apartment, the air thick with the scent of burnt coffee and damp paper. The document lay before her, its edges frayed and yellowed with age, the ink slightly smudged but still legible. The words stared back at her like a lifeline, a stark reminder that her father had not forgotten her, that he had once trusted her enough to entrust the family home as collateral for a debt he never repaid. The document was a powerful weapon, but it was also a double-edged sword. If Emily knew what Laura had, she would stop at nothing to discredit it, to paint her as the ungrateful, desperate older sister trying to rob her own family out of spite. Laura's mind raced with the implications. Emily had always been cunning, a master manipulator who could twist any situation to her advantage. And with her husband, Mark, a high-powered attorney specializing in estate law, Laura knew she was walking into a battle she was ill-prepared for. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Laura's heart jumped. She stood, her body tense, and peered through the peephole. Emily stood on the other side, her expression cold and calculating, a legal envelope clutched in her manicured hand. Laura took a deep breath and opened the door, forcing herself to meet her sister's icy gaze. Emily's eyes scanned Laura up and down, a slight smirk playing on her glossy lips. "I brought you a little something," Emily said, shoving the envelope against Laura's chest. "Consider it a courtesy." Laura took the envelope, her hands shaking as she tore it open. Inside was a formal notice from Mark's law firm, a cease and desist letter demanding that Laura vacate the family home within 30 days. It also stated that any attempts to contest the will would be considered frivolous litigation and that Emily would pursue damages for emotional distress. "Are you serious?" Laura said, her voice cracking. "You're evicting me?" "You have no right to that house, Laura," Emily said, crossing her arms over her chest. "Mom and Dad left it to me. They made their wishes perfectly clear. You're just dragging this out to make my life difficult." Laura felt a surge of anger rise in her chest, but she forced herself to stay calm. "I'm not dragging anything out. I have a document, a promissory note that Dad signed 20 years ago. It clearly states that the house was collateral for a loan he never repaid." Emily's expression didn't change, but a flicker of something dark and angry flashed in her eyes. "A promissory note? Are you joking? You think some piece of paper from 20 years ago is going to stand up in court? Dad was senile by then, Laura. He probably didn't even know what he was signing." "He wasn't senile," Laura shot back. "He was perfectly lucid, and I have witnesses who can attest to that. The notary, for one." Emily's jaw tightened. For a brief moment, the mask slipped, revealing a raw, simmering fury beneath. But then she composed herself, her smirk returning. "You do whatever you need to do, Laura," Emily said, leaning in close, her voice a venomous whisper. "But just know this, Mark is going to destroy you in court. And when he's done, you'll wish you'd taken that $5,000 and walked away." With that, Emily turned and strutted down the hallway, her heels clicking against the linoleum floor like a judge's gavel striking down a verdict. Laura slammed the door shut, her chest heaving. She clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms as she fought back tears. Emily was right. Mark was ruthless in the courtroom, a legal shark who had torn through clients like tissue paper. But Laura wasn't going to back down. Not this time. She grabbed her phone and dialed the number of the only lawyer she knew she could trust, Alan Goldstein. Alan had been her friend since college, a kind-hearted but fierce attorney who specialized in estate law. He had once told her that if she ever needed anything, all she had to do was ask. "Alan," Laura said as soon as he answered, "I need your help." Within an hour, Alan was at her apartment, his briefcase resting on the kitchen table as he carefully examined the promissory note. He wore a deep frown as he read the document, his eyes moving back and forth across the text. "This is compelling," Alan said, setting the paper down. "But it's not airtight. The fact that it's 20 years old will work against you. And if Emily's husband is handling her case, you're in for a nasty fight. Can they claim Dad was incompetent when he signed it?" Laura asked, her stomach twisting. Alan hesitated. "They can try. But if we can find the notary and any witnesses who were present when he signed it, we can argue that he was of sound mind. The fact that the document was notarized helps. But we need more than that. We need concrete evidence that the loan was never repaid. Laura's heart sank. I don't have anything else. Just the note. Alan nodded, his jaw tight. Then we need to gather evidence. Bank statements, transaction records, anything that shows your father never paid you back. And we need to do it fast. Emily's husband is going to come after you with everything he's got. And if he can prove that your father was coerced or mentally incompetent, the whole case could fall apart. Laura felt a cold sweat break out across her forehead. This was worse than she had imagined. Emily wasn't just going to fight her. She was going to try and bury her. I can help you, Laura, Alan said, his voice firm. But you need to be ready for a long, ugly battle. This isn't just about money. Emily wants to destroy you, and she has the resources to do it. Laura swallowed, her throat tight. Emily wanted to break her, to crush her under the weight of their parents' will and Mark's legal expertise. But Laura wasn't a child anymore. She was done being the overlooked, underestimated older sister. I'm ready, Laura said, her voice strong and clear. I'm not letting her take what's mine. Alan nodded, his expression grim. Then let's get to work. For the next 2 weeks, Laura and Alan worked tirelessly to gather evidence. They combed through bank records, credit card statements, old emails, and personal journals. They tracked down the notary who had witnessed the signing of the promissory note, an elderly man named Frank Delgado who still remembered the day clearly. I remember your dad, Frank said, his voice raspy and weathered. He was a proud man. Said he wanted to do right by you, make sure you were protected. I notarized that document myself. No corrupción. He knew exactly what he was doing. Laura's heart lifted. It was a small victory, but it was something, and with Frank willing to testify, they had a chance. But Emily wasn't sitting idle. She and Mark had already filed a counterclaim, alleging that Laura had fabricated the document and that Samuel Harrington had been suffering from early-onset dementia when he signed it. They claimed that Laura had manipulated her father, preying on his confusion to secure the house for herself. The accusations were brutal, painting Laura as a conniving, greedy daughter who had taken advantage of her own father in his final years. The smear campaign was relentless, and Laura could feel her resolve cracking under the pressure. Friends and family began to distance themselves, whispers and rumors spreading like wildfire. But through it all, Alan remained steadfast, his focus unwavering. They're trying to intimidate you, he said one night as they sat in his office, surrounded by stacks of legal documents and evidence. But we have the truth on our side, and we're going to use it. Laura nodded, her jaw clenched. Emily had underestimated her. They all had. And if it was a war her sister wanted, then it was a war she was going to get. Because Laura wasn't just fighting for the house. She was fighting for everything she had ever lost. Her dignity, her place in the family, her sense of self-worth. And this time, she was going to win. The courtroom was silent, the air heavy with tension as Laura Harrington sat at the plaintiff's table, her spine rigid, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Across the room, Emily sat next to her husband, Mark, her manicured nails tapping rhythmically against the wooden surface of the defense table. Mark leaned back in his chair, exuding the casual confidence of a man who had won more cases than he could count. He glanced over at Laura, his lips curling into a smug, knowing smile. Laura forced herself to keep her gaze fixed straight ahead, her jaw clenched so tight it ached. Alan sat beside her, shuffling through the stack of documents they had painstakingly compiled over the past few weeks. Every bank statement, every old email, every scrap of paper that could possibly prove her father had never repaid the loan. But was it enough? All rise, the bailiff announced, and everyone in the courtroom stood as the judge entered. Judge Marian Lopez, a stern-looking woman in her 60s, with a no-nonsense demeanor and a reputation for being a stickler for evidence, took her seat. You may be seated, she said, her sharp eyes scanning the room as the gallery settled back down. We are here today to hear the case of Harrington versus Harrington, regarding the contested inheritance of the Harrington family home. Counsel for the plaintiff, you may proceed. Alan stood, buttoning his jacket as he approached the bench. He began his opening statement with calm, measured authority, detailing how Samuel Harrington had borrowed $150,000 from his daughter, Laura, 20 years ago to keep the family business afloat. How he had signed a legally binding promissory note that clearly stated the house was collateral if the loan was not repaid. How, upon his death, the debt remained unpaid, making Laura the rightful owner of the property. For the defense to claim that my client is attempting to defraud her own family is not only preposterous, but it is also a cruel mischaracterization of the facts, Allen said, his voice steady and firm. We will present irrefutable evidence that the loan was never repaid and that the promissory note was executed with full mental clarity by Samuel Harrington, witnessed and notarized by a credible third party. Allen returned to his seat, his jaw set, his eyes steely. Laura exhaled a tiny, shaky breath and glanced over at Emily. Her sister's face was stone cold, her eyes fixed on the table, her expression unreadable. Defense counsel, your opening statement, Judge Lopez said, her tone clipped. Mark Harrington stood, flashing his signature confident grin. He strolled to the center of the room with the easy swagger of a man who believed himself untouchable. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, his voice smooth and dripping with false sincerity. What we have here is nothing more than a desperate attempt by a failed daughter to manipulate the memory of her deceased father for her own financial gain. My client, Emily Harrington, was the sole recipient of the family home as stated clearly in the will. This so-called promissory note that Miss Harrington is waving around is nothing more than a fabrication, a sham intended to undermine the last wishes of a dying man. Mark paused, turning to face the jury, his expression somber. We will prove that Samuel Harrington was suffering from early-onset dementia at the time he allegedly signed this document. We will also show that Laura Harrington, a woman with a history of financial irresponsibility, pressured her father into signing away the house under false pretenses. Laura's stomach twisted, her fingernails digging into her palms. Allen leaned in, his voice a low, calming whisper. Stay calm. We're ready for this. The trial dragged on for days. Witnesses were called, evidence was presented, and tensions ran high. Emily took the stand, her eyes brimming with perfectly timed tears as she recounted how Laura had manipulated their father, taking advantage of his declining mental state to secure the promissory note. My father was confused, Emily said, her voice trembling. He didn't know what he was signing. Laura took advantage of him, knowing he wasn't in his right mind. She's always been greedy, always out for herself. This is just another one of her schemes. Mark nodded sympathetically, his hand resting on Emily's shoulder as if to steady her, as if to reassure the jury that she was the real victim here. Laura bit her tongue until she tasted blood, her fists clenched beneath the table. But then it was Laura's turn to take the stand. Allen guided her through her testimony, asking her to recount the events of 20 years ago, the day her father had come to her in the den, asking for help. Laura spoke clearly, her voice steady and unwavering as she described her father's desperation, his promise to repay the loan, his insistence that the house be used as collateral. Did you ever receive repayment for the loan? Allen asked. No, Laura said, meeting the judge's gaze. Not a single cent. And did your father ever indicate that he regretted signing the promissory note? No, Laura said firmly. He told me he wanted to protect me. He said he didn't want me to be left with nothing. Allen nodded, turning to the jury. No further questions. Then came the turning point. Frank Delgado, the notary who had signed the promissory note, took the stand. His testimony was crucial, the one piece of evidence that could corroborate Laura's story. I remember that day clearly, Frank said, his voice strong despite his advanced age. Samuel Harrington was fully lucid. He knew exactly what he was signing. There was no confusion, no coercion. He told me that he was proud of his daughter for stepping up to help the family in a time of need. Mark stood to cross-examine, his eyes narrowed. Mr. Delgado, isn't it true that you suffered a stroke 2 years ago? Isn't it possible that your memory is compromised? Frank's jaw tightened, but his gaze remained steady. I remember what happened that day, he said firmly. I signed that document, and Samuel Harrington was a sound mind. The courtroom fell silent. Mark clenched his jaw, frustration flashing across his face. Laura felt a surge of hope rise in her chest. Alan squeezed her hand under the table, his expression triumphant. Closing arguments followed. Mark did his best to paint Laura as a greedy opportunist, but the jury's faces were unreadable. Alan spoke with quiet conviction, reminding them that the evidence spoke for itself. A notarized document, a debt that was never repaid, and a daughter who had been betrayed not only by her sister, but by her parents' broken promise. The jury deliberated for hours. Laura sat in the hallway, her stomach churning, her head throbbing. Emily sat across from her, arms crossed, her eyes fixed on a spot on the floor. When the jury finally filed back into the courtroom, the tension was palpable. Judge Lopez asked the foreman to stand. In the matter of Harrington versus Harrington, the foreman said, his voice clear and firm, "We find in favor of the plaintiff, Laura Harrington. The court finds that the promissory note is valid and enforceable, and that the property located at 1425 Meadow Lane shall be transferred to Laura Harrington as repayment of the unpaid debt." Laura's eyes filled with tears as the words sank in. It was over. She had won. Emily leaped to her feet, her face contorted with fury. "You can't do this. That house is mine." Judge Lopez banged her gavel, her eyes flashing. "Miss Harrington, sit down. The ruling is final." Emily stormed out, Mark trailing after her, his face dark with rage. Laura sank into her seat, tears streaming down her face as Alan squeezed her hand. "It's over," Alan said softly. "You did it." Later that evening, Laura stood alone in the empty house, the echo of her footsteps the only sound. The walls were bare, the rooms empty, but it was hers now. She walked into the living room, her gaze falling on the faded spot on the carpet where her father's chair used to sit. For the first time in years, she felt at peace. Emily had taken everything from her, but she had reclaimed herself, her dignity, her worth, and the home where she would rebuild her life.